the respiratory system, bringing air in, letting air head out, but really aiding in gas exchange, oxygen, carbon dioxide, but also dealing with pH balancing. So some of the things we're going to get to as we start going through the respiratory system. Now we start talking about respiration, the act of breathing. It's not just air in and air out. There's more to it than that. First off, we have pulmonary ventilation. In pulmonary ventilation, that's when the air is going into and coming out of the lungs. It's what you typically think of when you think of breathing. And that falls squarely in the respiratory system. We then have what's referred to as external respiration. Now, external respiration is when the gases, think of oxygen, carbon dioxide, when they're exchanging across the alveolar membranes. So they're going either from inside the lungs into the blood, or going from the blood back into the lungs. Now that, if you notice, has an overlap of the respiratory system and the circulatory system, because we're going to and from the blood. So that's external respiration. Think of external as in from the outside environment, getting across our membranes. We then have the transport. How do you get carbon dioxide and oxygen from the lungs out to every other body tissue from head to foot? So transportation. And then also we have internal respiration. Internal respiration is again the exchange of gases across a membrane. You're going across the membrane from the blood into your actual tissues, think muscles and organs, or going from those organs back into the blood. So in a kind of round circuit kind of idea, you breathe air in. Oxygen now goes across the alveolar membrane into the blood, transports throughout the body, reaches a muscle. It goes from the blood into the muscle. That would be the internal respiration. But internal respiration is also the carbon dioxide from that muscle going into the blood, then transports back to the lungs, then it leaves the blood, goes into the lungs to be exhaled. That was external respiration, and then pulmonary ventilation. So it depends on which gas it is. Carbon dioxide, heading out. Oxygen, you want to bring in. So here's a basic idea of what we have component-wise. Looking at first the nasal cavity, the nostrils. Sure, that's the main way you get air into your body. You're thinking, hold on, how about the mouth? Get to that 1 second. The main way in is your nose. Traditionally, most individuals are breathing the majority of the day through their nose. Now, sure, you might have to breathe through your mouth at times, but breathing through your mouth doesn't have quite the same benefits as breathing through your nose. And if you're wondering why, think about that for a second. We're going to come back to that in a couple slides and explain more how the nose is working. So you get down to the pharynx, back of the nose, nasal cavity, heading down towards the lungs. We mentioned the mouth, the oral cavity, heading down to the larynx. Larynx is just the top part of where you're heading down into the trachea. Trachea then goes all the way down and you split into two. A right and left main bronchus, or also known as the right and left primary bronchus, or singular bronchi. So the idea is bronchus, bronchi, single plural, either one works as you're labeling, that's perfectly fine. Then you have the very bottom, the lungs, sure, right and left, and the diaphragm. Diaphragm is the muscle that helps to expand the lungs as you're breathing, basically pulling air into your lungs. So these functional different zones, you have the functional anatomy zones. You have the respiratory zone. Now, the respiratory zone is where gas exchange is actually occurring. It's occurring in the respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and the alveoli. So you're exchanging gas across these membranes. Now, other areas, things like the trachea, things like the main bronchus, those are conducting zones. Conducting zones are simply a way to get the air from outside down to the respiratory zones. So there's no gas exchange occurring in the conducting zone. The conducting zones, the air that goes in there, has to get down to the respiratory zone for it to be utilized. If it only gets down to the trachea and then you exhale back out, that air that was in the trachea never actually reached the lungs, was not utilized. And then respiratory muscles. We mentioned the diaphragm already, but think back to AP1. There were some other ones that were in between the ribs. Those were the intercostals. Looking at the internal and external intercostals as well. So between those three different muscles, we'll have to figure out how breathing works later on as we get to future videos. All right, the nose. What does it do? Sure, it breathes in. It smells. But what else? Well, it's the airway, but it moistens and warms the air. This is one of the biggest reasons why it's important to breathe through your nose compared to the mouth. In the nose, you're going to help to increase the temperature of the air you inhale. Where in the mouth, it's a faster, more direct route, so the air doesn't get as warm. Think about if you've ever been outside in very cold weather, think 0 degrees out. And you take a big breath of air. Sometimes you might feel a little burning, a little bit of pain in the chest because that seriously cold air got right into your lungs. But the nose, breathe in, doesn't cause the same problem. You had more of a chance to increase the temperature before it got down to the lungs. Secondly, the idea of moisture, so it moistens. Well, not only moistens going in, helps to reclaim the moisture coming out. Then again, in very cold weather, that's 0 degrees, you exhale out your mouth. You can see that cloud of moisture that came out. But breathe out your nose in the same temperature, you won't see as much of a cloud. You might see a little bit, but it won't be as dense because more of that moisture is reclaimed by the nasal passage. It also filters and cleans out the air a bit. That allows the air that comes in, because this is not sterile air, it's not perfectly clean, there's debris in it, there's dust, there's whatever. That gets trapped in the mucus and doesn't reach your lungs as easily as if you were inhaling through your mouth. So it's helping out to also protect a little more as well. Two very important functions of the nose compared to breathing through the mouth. Now sure, are there times you have to breathe through the mouth? Yes, it happens. If you're really exercising, good chance is your nose just doesn't cut it. You're simply not able to inhale enough air fast enough. Or maybe you're sick and your nose is clogged. You have to breathe through your mouth. So there are different reasons, but majority of the time, the nose is better. The nose sounds as a resonating chamber, or serves as a resonating chamber as well. Sure, it sounds like that. But think about, if you ever pinched your nose and try to talk, it sounds a different tone, different pitch, because you don't have that same resonating chamber. And your olfactory receptors. Olfactory, think smell. If you've ever been sick and try to smell some food or something, it doesn't quite smell the same because the olfactory receptors are blocked up. All right, the nose has two main areas, two main regions. We have the external nose. External, think the nostrils. That's what's actually right in the very outside. It's what leads into the nose. You then also going to have the nasal cavity. So that's what's more inside. Nasal cavity, you have the nasal septum, splitting it right in the middle. So there is a right and left side, hence the right and left nostril. You got division. Think back to AP1, that nasal septum was divided by what bones? A little higher up? Because it's cartilage up front, but higher up you had the ethmoid bone partially in there. Remember that perpendicular plate came down. You had underneath, you had the vomer coming up. So you had two bones helping make the posterior aspect of that nasal septum. Now the roof of the nasal cavity, still ethmoid, but now sphenoid bones in there as well. And the floor, well, it divides it from the oral cavity. So we have the hard and soft palates. So you're creating this nasal cavity inside your head. Now the very anterior part where you said the nostrils, that was the nostril right there. But notice, this is all cartilage. That cartilage, if you're looking at a skeleton, isn't there. That's why there's some flexibility at the tip of the nose, because the cartilage can move. So we have all this hyaline cartilage present here. The bones are higher up. They're more in the bridge of the nose. That's where you find those nasal bones. Now, the nasal cavity we're talking about is going to be posterior to the vestibule. The vestibule is the opening just after the nostrils. Now, that is going to be filled with vibrissae. Now, vibrissae are the hairs inside of your nose. They're going to help with basically trapping and getting rid of particles that you inhale. Think about dust or debris. It helps prevent those things from getting too far up into the nose and eventually into the lungs. You have your olfactory mucosa. The olfactory mucosa is the superior nasal cavity. So it's what's up towards the top, closer to the roof where you actually have the bottom of the brain. So all the way up top is where we're looking at this. That's where the smell receptors are. So a lot, not all of them, but a lot of the smell receptors are found more superiorly up in this olfactory mucosa. Now the rest of the mucosa is respiratory mucosa. In this case now, pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Well, it makes sense of the cilia because you got to move the mucus around. So we have these pseudostratified here. Mucus, you're going to have serous secretions here that are helping to protect. There's things like lysosomes in there, defensins. You're trying to make sure that anything that's a pathogen that gets inhaled is trying to be destroyed. Because your lungs, the inside of your lungs, that air's got a straight shot from the outside of your environment. That's why you have these different specialized structures to try to protect yourself, as well as think back to the lymphatic system. We talked about the tonsils and other things. They're up and around trying to help out here. Now, the key thing that I mentioned with the cilia before, moving the mucus, moves it posteriorly. Well, think about it. Mucus going posterior means going back. It goes back to the throat. So a lot of the mucus that's up in your nose, that's trapping these particles, this dirt, this debris, these pathogens, is being dumped down to the throat, which goes right to the stomach. That very acidic environment in the stomach we talked about destroys most pathogens. People say, oh, hold on, sometimes I have a runny nose. Sure. If you have a cold, if you have allergies, that's when this process, this posterior movement of the cilia just cannot keep up. Or simply it's just overwhelmed. It's still shuttling stuff back, but just there's too much of it and it can't do that. Or if you ever notice, if you're outside when it's really cold out, the nasal cavity simply just drains. The cilia get too cold and cannot function properly. Which means all that mucus, instead of going posterior, is draining out anteriorly in very cold weather. So that inhalation, when you breathe in through that mucosa, is trying to increase the moisture and the temperature. Because the outside air usually isn't the same as the temperature of the inside of your body. Now sure, middle of summer you can get up to those same temps, but more often than not, it's not that same temp as your core temp. So what it's doing is it's increasing the temperature and moisture, all because of this superficial capillary network, and veins for that matter. You have nerve endings in there. Well, sure, you've probably sneezed at some time in your life. The nerve endings are triggered if something irritates it, and then you sneeze. So the irritation of the nerve endings triggers a sneeze. So here's a mid-sagittal cut, just a little different view than we saw previously. First things first, nostril, air comes in. We have the vestibule. That nasal vestibule is just the very beginning part here. It's just the opening. A vestibule is an entryway. Maybe you've heard of a vestibule in an office building. You walk in the door and you have this area as a vestibule or the lobby. Same idea. Vestibule is the way in. You then have these nasal conchae. Notice the nasal conchae. You're going to have the superior nasal conchae, the middle nasal conchae, and the inferior nasal conchae. Those are these ridges. Each one of these ridges, kind of like these protruding sections, is a nasal conchae. And then in between, these divots in between, those are the nasal meatai. There's a superior nasal meatai, an inferior nasal meatai, and right between is the middle nasal meatai. Those are going to help increase the turbulence in the air. Because as you breathe in, it's not a flat surface. There's these curves, these indents. It increases surface area and causes turbulence to mix the air up. That means more air comes into the contact with the surface. Therefore, there's more moisture being put up into the air in your nose. There's more heat being transferred into that. And all the particles that are being breathed in are having a better chance of being hit against the membrane, where they're trapped and then gotten rid of. So the nasal conchae and nasal meatai are increasing turbulence to help with increasing moisture, increasing temperature, and trapping particles and debris. You then head to the back. That's the nasopharynx. This region is the nasopharynx. It's the very top portion or top region of the pharynx. From there, you head down to the oropharynx, back of the mouth, and then you get down to the laryngopharynx. Keep in mind, we already talked about back to lymphatics. Here is going to be your lingual tonsil. Here is your palatine tonsil. And then up here, that is your pharyngeal tonsil. Remember, all those tonsils are helping with lymphatic tissue. All right, so continuing our way down, going to the pharynx. We get to the larynx now. That's the area just below that. This is the larynx. The larynx is going to have two little folds right here, here and here. And I'll show you a more blown up view of that in later videos. But that is the vestibular fold, and then we have the actual vocal fold. Vocal fold is going to be your vocal cords. So we'll get to that more in a little bit. Just give you an idea of where they are. The very bottom portion down here, well, what goes on below the larynx, that now is heading down the trachea. And then behind the trachea is the esophagus. We talked about that with the digestive chapter, so I'll leave the esophagus alone for now. Just be aware of orientation. Trachea is anterior, esophagus is posterior. All right, nasal mucosa and the conchae. Now I mentioned again already about filtering, heating, and moisturizing the air. That is the main purpose of these conchae, meant to increase turbulence. During exhalation though, notice this, they're reclaiming the heat and reclaiming the moisture. Now, can it reclaim all the heat and all the moisture? No. The air that you're exhaling, if it comes out the nose, has more being reclaimed than the mouth. But even exhalation out the nose, you can notice that that still has a little more moisture than what the air around you has. Still is a little bit warmer than what's around, because you can't reclaim all of it coming out. All right, sinuses. Now, this is the same thing we talked about back in AP1 in the skeletal chapter with the skull. Where are the sinuses in your skull? Think of this one back to which bones. Now, looking at a couple different bones here. Looking at the frontal, the sphenoid, the ethmoid, and the maxillary bones, all containing these sinuses. They're meant to help lighten the skull, but key thing here is they're warming up the air. They contain air, so therefore that's a pocket of air that's already warm, which means it helps to warm up the air coming into the head. So as you breathe in, you've got this warming air and it heads down to your lungs. Again, the warmer air is protecting the lungs. Key thing there. So a lot of different parts and pieces, just starting with the nose. We haven't even gotten to the trachea really and the lungs. So just the nose plays a huge role in respiration, in speech, and in protecting your body from lymphatics and immunity. So protection there as well.